face-to-face webinar hosted by Red Wing Consulting. To begin today's presentation, I'd like to introduce Victoria Ybanez, Executive Director. Victoria?
Thank you, Brenda. Hi, everybody. My name is Victoria Ybanez, and I work at Red Wind Consulting. Red Wind is a national tribal technical assistance provider working with the Office on Violence Against Women with the Grants to Tribal Governments program, or as many of you are familiar with it as CTAS. Through Red Wind, we offer a variety of training and consultations, either on-site or through one-to-one through email and telephone as well. I myself have been doing this work for about 30 years now and have been involved in the development and operations of both shelter and transitional housing programs over the years, and then have done quite a bit of work helping tribes develop their emergency shelter or transitional housing program. And so with what we're going to cover today, we're going to talk about creating sister space. And when we think about that, for me, when I think about emergency shelter and transitional housing and creating sister space, we are creating a space that is going to support and enhance a person's ability to make some of the hard decisions and choices in their life as they're getting their feet back on the ground, recovering from and putting things in place in response to the violence that's occurred to them. Working in shelter and transitional housing programs, I think it's some of the hardest work we'll do because we're actually working with people who are living within our programs. So we have a different level of access to their lives. And we'll go through and we'll talk about that with a little bit more detail here in a few minutes. So when we think about the work that we do, people are surviving physical or sexual violence. And I love this quote because it says that some survive as a result of the services they receive in the aftermath of abuse. And it really reminds us that the work that we are doing has this really unique opportunity to make a difference in people's lives, helping to put in place a foundation so they can really take the time to examine the different options that they have available to them, and in that, make those difficult choices. So one of the things I wanted to talk a little bit about is the difference. As I've worked with programs over the years, I have noticed that sometimes people use the language of shelter and transitional housing interchangeably. And they actually are two distinct different types of responses that we have available. And so when we think about shelter, we're actually thinking about an emergency response. So this is something where there's an incident that's occurred, and whether that's an act of physical violence or some other act that the victim believes that there's an increased risk of threat. And so someone would go into this immediate responsive emergency shelter, giving them an opportunity for immediate safety, and then from that, actually responding to the crisis. So oftentimes the length of stay in a shelter is short-term, and that ranges from a few days to a few months. Some programs have kind of a standard of 30 days, some will go 60 days, some will go 90 days. Tribes tend to be a little creative with that because our options are different in our tribal communities. And transitional housing is a response that goes beyond that immediate emergency. And so a lot of times when we think of transitional housing, we think of it as a range of approximately 6 months to 2 years. And programs structure that differently. Some people say 3 months up to 18 months, or 3 months up to a year, or 6 months up to 2 years. One of the things I want to point out is through OVW and the OVW funding that as a person is using OVW funding on their transitional housing program, the requirement is a minimum of 6 months up to a maximum of 24 days. And when we think about that time span, if somebody comes into transitional housing and they stay only a year, then they can still come back at another time and stay only up to another year. So the cumulative total is 24 months. But clearly the minimum length of time in the program is 6 months. And one of the differences with transitional housing is how extensive the program services are. So it goes beyond the immediate crisis response and looks at more longer-term advocacy. Safety planning is always a key component of that. And then other issues are addressed and looked at and explored. And so when we think about economic stability, stabilizing the household, the family, and having long-term plans for housing in place is some of the kind of work that takes place in transitional housing. And then I just added permanent housing so people could see the difference. And that as when we think of permanent housing, we're thinking about long-term stability. The length of stay is ongoing. There is no minimum or maximum. And oftentimes there's no programming involved, but that's not an absolute. Sometimes people get into supportive housing that has an aspect of programming that supports households. So when we think about transitional housing, we really want to think about, in shelter, we really want to be thinking about the survivor's needs. And as we think about the survivor's needs, I think one of the critical pieces is to create a space with time so that survivor can really get on their feet, start to stabilize and make choices about their life. So when you think about yourself and a crisis that's occurred, and some of us, when we know the statistics about violence against Native women, some of us may have experience with domestic violence or sexual violence and have experienced a crisis like that. But we may have experienced other forms of crisis, whether it was the passing of a loved one or the loss of economic security through the loss of a job or just other kinds of life events. And when we think about that, we can really recognize like that immediate kind of jolt that happened to us that where we were starting to process and try to make sense of this crisis. And I know for myself that initially in a personal crisis, I go to a place of feeling numb, almost like everything happening around me is surreal. And in that immediate period of the crisis to shortly after that, personally, I have a difficult time making decisions. You know, would you like a glass of milk or a glass of water? I don't know. It's too much to ask of me right now. And so I just wanted to bring that to the front of your mind. And as you think about survivors coming into the program, that they have experienced a crisis. And a lot of times people are right there, you know, offering paperwork and, you know, let's get you on a housing list. Let's do our safety planning right now. What's going on with your children going into school, and are there other health needs or medical needs that you might have as a result of the incident that occurred? And it becomes oftentimes overwhelming. And so we really want to think about the kind of environment that we are creating for those survivors to really move forward in that individual experience of the immediate crisis and move through the trauma effect of possibly even an ongoing experience with crisis living with violence, and come to that place of starting to be able to see what they need and want in their lives. And so when we think about making immediate decisions in that crisis, they may not be necessarily good decisions. And so when I think about creating sister space, for me, it's about thinking about how we create that space. Like if I think about my own sister in her own personal crisis, how I would want to act and treat her in that process that she is having to deal with as a result of that crisis. So that means I may just slow down a little bit and give her that space to think about what has just happened here. What does this mean to me? What does this mean to my children if I have children? And what are some of the pressing next steps that I need to take, and what are some of the other steps that I'll want to take after those more critical steps. So when I think about our shelter and transitional housing work, there's a few guiding principles that we want to incorporate in what we're doing. One is that we want it to be survivor-centered. And so what that means to me is that we operate in a way that benefits the survivor. So a lot of times as we create policies and structures, oftentimes the purpose behind them are about creating efficiency and streamlining the work of the advocate. And the reality is that sometimes that structure doesn't create the kind of comfort and support that a survivor might need. So when we're creating a program that is victim and survivor centered, we're going to create a program that's really going to take into account the needs of that survivor. And that survivor is going to benefit from the work of our program. And then also we're going to provide strict confidentiality. And this is something that when I'm talking with a lot of programs, that everybody on a basic level understand confidentiality. But then when it comes into practical application of confidentiality, there are ways that there are potential leaks that occur within the program. And that could be just really simple things of having a phone call with a survivor come in and talking to that person on the phone and not taking the time to shut their office door, or if they don't have an office door to shut, to go to a private space to have that conversation. Or it could be something as simple as talking to somebody, thinking that they're describing the situation without anything identifiable, but yet within our own small community, we know, because some of us have police scanners, that we heard that there was a call at that house. We know something went down over there. So then based on what we're hearing in this story, we're making the connection to what we heard on the police scanner. So there's lots of ways that a person's privacy and confidentiality don't get protected, and it really requires the program to really think through multiple ways that we act as advocates and communicate within our own program and within the tribal administrative structure in ways that uncovers where there could be potential risks to confidentiality for a survivor. And one of the reasons that confidentiality is so important is that a little bit of information going out, while it may not seem important or opening up anything that might be problematic, it really could uncover where that survivor is at so that offender could find that person. It raises a risk to that person's potential, creates more dangerousness and raises a risk for them being harmed. And so, which leads into the next guiding principle, which is about centralizing victim safety. So that as we are developing our structures, our policies, our operating procedures, and we want to be looking at how we are really taking into account victim safety in everything that we do. Making sure that when we write something down, is this something that could potentially be subpoenaed? Do we have protections as a confidential advocate? Or is that not something that is afforded within our tribe in the way our program operates? We want to make sure that information about the children is protected in a way that that offender can't go and take the children from the school and then, in effect, kidnap them and use them as a tool to access that survivor. So something that might seem not very important or not very critical actually could be extremely critical. So we want to look at every aspect of what we do and how we operate to ensure that survivor and victim safety is centered in there. The other thing that's really important is that we want to have the victims and survivors to be shaping and informing what we do. Oftentimes I see where programs get developed and there's a structure that gets put in place, rules, practices, things that are being done and offered, but there hasn't been a means to find out, so what do survivors need? And we need to be asking those questions. So we could develop our program and be operating and it appears just fine, and after a few years, if we haven't asked what they need, we haven't recognized that their needs have changed and evolved over time. So we need to build in a mechanism to incorporate the voices of victims and survivors to shape and inform what we do. Oftentimes I've seen where people create advisory committees or councils of former participants or community women to inform and educate the program on what's needed and how they think it might work for them. And that's a very helpful tool to incorporate into the way you operate. So as we think about creating sister space, I love this graphic because it really, I think it lays out some things that are really critically important as we look at how we shape and define our emergency shelter and our transitional housing programs. And one of the things that sits center to all of that is that survivors' personal sovereignty. And so when we think about their sovereignty, another way to call it is their personal autonomy. So a survivor always has the ability to make their own decisions and their own choices, that we don't create a program that is conditional. And what I mean by that is you can come into our program on the condition that you get a protection order. And that's one example, where people create a rule and say that if we do this for you, then you must do that. And so by doing that and creating a structure like that, we're starting to diminish that survivor's personal sovereignty and take away their ability to make decisions in their life. And one of the things that I know in working with survivors is that they themselves have been the ones to survive some very dangerous situations, and they are the ones that are going to know what's going to keep them the safest. Sometimes through the help of being asked questions and exploring things with an advocate, they can see that clearly, but they will more clearly understand what's going to keep them safe and then ultimately they live with the consequences of the actions they take. So for instance, the example that I gave, that you can come into our program, but you must get a protection order. And so that rule, while on the surface seems like, well, what's the problem with asking a survivor or expecting a survivor to get a protection order? If all of this dangerous stuff is going on, a protection order should help that person. In theory, it should. The reality is the practice of getting that protection order, of serving those papers, of going to court, could actually provoke and instigate a situation and make it worse. And then if our local response and enforcement of protection orders is not very strong, basically we are asking them to get a piece of paper that may not have the backing of the criminal justice system to enforce and protect. So again, it goes back to that survivor lives with the consequences of the actions. So if we impose an action on that survivor lives with it, and we go home at night and sleep fine in our bed, and that survivor has to go and face and deal with the consequences of that. And then with that, we also want to think about how, when we look at the dynamics of power and control and how much has been taken away from a survivor as a result of the tactics of power and control that abuser has used, that we want to create an environment that supports and empowers the survivors and not diminishes their ability to make decisions and have control over their own lives. So in this graphic, when we look at what we create, we're going to honor all of the relationships of the survivor. And in particular, when I think about a lot of programs that we've seen in mainstream communities, they actually will have restrictions on ages of male children that can come into shelter or into a transitional housing program. And the reason they will say is that women feel uncomfortable with people who are, men in the community. And so as boys grow up and start to become men, that they say that it makes women uncomfortable in a community living situation. The reality is if we consider honoring all our relationships, we will recognize how important and critical our relationships are to us, and we won't, in a time of crisis and difficulty for a survivor, ask that survivor to break up their family to seek safety. We will find options to accommodate that household, and sometimes that household might include children who are 16, 17-year-old males growing up. They might include a grandmother that's living in the household helping with the children. And we won't say, well, this program's only for the mother who's threatened with violence, and this teenage boy and this grandmother can't come with, and ask them to break up their household. If our facility doesn't accommodate that family structure, then we'll have a backup plan to be able to accommodate that. Also, our program will be holistic. We will work to address the complex needs of the survivor. So instead of just looking at one piece of their life, we will look at and work to support and address the complexities of what that person needs. And one of the key things as we think about someone having options to be able to live a safe life, sometimes a critical aspect of that is to have stable housing, to have a job to be able to pay the rent and put food on the table. to be able to have access to medical care, to not be struggling with physical ailments, so that you can focus clearly on the job and focus on the parenting. So we need to make sure that we're taking a holistic approach as opposed to a fragmented approach. Our program would also demonstrate respect for women. And I say women loosely, just recognizing the gendered nature of domestic violence and sexual violence. In our programs, we may serve men as victims and survivors, and the reality is that as we're looking at who we are serving, the vast majority will be women. And so as we look at our program and what we're developing, our structure, our policies, our practices, everything we put in place will demonstrate that respect for the survivors and victims that we are working with. And in demonstrating that respect, we're going to create an environment that really supports their ability to make decisions and choices about the direction they're going in their lives. And when I think about demonstrating respect, one of the things, I review a lot of policies for tribal governments programs on emergency shelter and transitional housing. And it's interesting to me when we think about the historical nature of violence that has occurred in Indian country and how we have had many practices and things that have happened that have been centered in termination. And I'm sure many of you can think of examples of policies of termination, practices and actions of termination against Native people since the onset of colonization. And when we think about what we create in our programs and our policies and our rules and the way we operate, I'm often shocked when I sit down and I read through a list of policies and it lays out, well, if you need to do this, this, and this, and if you don't, we're going to terminate you. And so there's a language that we carry in our policies that doesn't demonstrate respect. It demonstrates control over another person. And so we really want to think about the language that we use and the way that we communicate that so that every aspect of what we do is demonstrating respect. And then we also need to have integrity. And so basically what that means to me is that when we develop our programs and our policies, a lot of times we have a beautiful mission statement or a guiding vision, and we might even incorporate our tribal teachings, which is an important aspect of what we do. But then the way we deliver it, it doesn't match. And we want to make sure that what we create on paper and what we do in our human interaction matches. And that to me is integrity. So what we say we do is what we do. And that when we say we want to empower and support and we're going to show respect, our actions will clearly show that. When I started, I mentioned about some of this work is some of the hardest work that we will do because people are living in our program and we will have access to them to some degree throughout the day and be in their living spaces, sit in their living room if they're living in transitional housing, see them in shelter if it's a communal living situation. And there's a whole range of challenging issues that a program will deal with. And I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them today because there's quite a few different things that can come up. But I want to touch on a few things that are fairly common across just about every program I've ever worked in or worked with. And one critical problem is alcohol and drug use. And I think it's important for us to recognize how alcohol and drugs get used, sometimes as a survival mechanism. And I've worked with some women over the years when I was doing advocacy where women would say that I drink because if I stop drinking, I won't live. Because the pain is so deep in them that they need something to numb it. And while in itself it's part of the tools that they have used to survive, it's not a healthy tool to use. And so then as program people working to create an atmosphere where people can look at their lives, make choices, examine the safety that they need, and look at how to keep themselves safe, how to keep their children safe, and how to take some of the next steps to rebuilding their lives after the violence. We would look and think that, well, nobody's allowed to drink here. And we start to make blanket rules. And again, this is one of those things that in theory sounds like a good idea to be able to say, well, nobody can drink while they're a program participant. And the reality is by doing a rule like that, what we end up doing is we start to create a different dynamic in the program. Whereas when we are working with people with alcohol problems that are beyond a little bit of alcohol abuse and are maybe alcoholism or addictions, chemical dependency, that by creating rigidity within the program, we force it underground so that it stops people from coming and asking for help. So instead of creating rules that shut down communication, we want to build in the way to start asking and raising points of discussion around how this is not a helpful thing and how it's harming their lives, and that as they're identifying how they want their lives to be different, then we want to be pointing out to them that the use of alcohol and drugs is interfering with that and how we can help them explore how to do something different with that and hook them up with some of the support and resources to look at it. And so it's not something that we'll do and be involved and take one action on. The reality is we need to be involved talking and gently nudging and exploring and helping them to see themselves and mirroring back how this is problematic. Another challenging issue I want to talk about is when survivors are frozen in space or immobilized. A lot of times we'll be in a program and we have an expectation that they're doing things. People come into emergency shelter and right away we're aware that they can only stay a short period of time, and we know how difficult it is to get housing, and yet people might be frozen in space because of the trauma they've experienced. And when we're working with people in transitional housing and they've got multiple incidents of violence that they're dealing with, they can also be immobilized to where they aren't looking at other options, they're not exploring things, and you just see things kind of crumbling around them. And people become challenged to figure out how do we break through that. And it really requires a lot of patience and persistence to help people to gently move forward. And I just want to bring you back to remembering your own personal experience with crisis and recognize that not everybody's going to experience it the same way you did. You may have been numb for a few days or a few hours and then started to kind of snap out of it and start to get involved very actively. or you may have just been immobilized for a longer period of time. And I think about, as an example, someone dear to me who recently lost somebody in their life, and that was very intimately connected. And in that process of days, weeks, and months that followed, it was difficult for her to clean her house. It was difficult for her to put one foot in front of the other. And the reality was is she did put one foot in front of the other, but she wasn't able to do the multiple things she would have done before this crisis. She was only able to do maybe one thing or two things instead of 5 or 6 or 8 things. And we want to recognize that when we're working with somebody who appears to be just kind of frozen in space, and find ways to gently communicate, gently nudge, and to support them. And sometimes, and I hear people talk about codependency, and sometimes what we want to do is to walk with them holding their hand. And when I hear people talk about codependency, they say, well, we don't want to, create a dependency here, so we give them the phone number and want them to make the phone call. We tell them the office they need to go to, and they need to go take care of it. The reality is that if we're creating a victim-centered program, we need to work with that victim where they're at in the moment. We also want to think about attitudes and resistance. And I know in my experience of working with people over the years that there have been times I have worked with somebody who has been really mouthy to me. And they have just fought me at every corner. And I need to be aware that that is not personal. That is not because they're fighting me. They're fighting something else. Oftentimes when people have lived with so much violence, one of the things that people talk about is that there's this process of where you're connecting and recognizing how angry you are about all of this. So then that starts to kind of seep out all over the place. And so when we think about the work that we're doing, we want to recognize as people are acting in these different ways that we need to be patient and persistent and gentle. And in that, I think one of the things that's really important is that we need to be processing this and thinking this through with other staff people, whether it's your direct supervisor or if you're fortunate to have another advocate in your office to talk through some of those kinds of things. Also, if some of the issues are really complex, you'll want to put in place some specific training to help you work through some of these things. And I always tell people to think about what-if scenarios. You have an idea of some of those hard situations you're going to deal with. So sit down with another person or a few more people and just say, what if this happened? And then start thinking about how can you handle that in a way that honors those core guiding principles and values that you have in your program so that you continue to demonstrate respect, you're victim-centered in your response, and you're operating with integrity. We really have a small window of opportunity to be making a difference in people's lives. And when I say that window of opportunity, like when we think about someone coming into our program, everything we do builds that tone, sets that dynamic of our relationship with that person. And so we want to really be mindful of the way we're communicating our personal follow-through and how we're working in ways that creates that environment that helps to embrace that person where they're at. When I think about dynamics of domestic violence, one of the things we hear all the time from survivors is that message they hear repeatedly that they're no good. Just look at you. Look at how you are. Look at how you act. Who would want you? Who would love you? Repeated kinds of messages like that. So we want to set a tone that really extends care and compassion so that we take this window of opportunity to demonstrate to them that they're worth something, that they are important in this world, and that we care about them. And we may not, in that short time that we have contact with them, be able to see the fruits of that work that we do. And that, it's unfortunate that we don't get to do that. But the reality is as long as we are caring and compassionate, they may see the fruits of the work that we do. And that's more important than us seeing it, is for them to fully experience and come to a place of valuing themselves so they are making healthy choices and see the opportunities in their lives. So when we think about that sister space, I always go back to thinking about my sister in crisis and what would I do and how would I offer support to her if she were experiencing domestic violence or sexual violence, if she were trying to struggle through making hard choices. And in that, advocacy is quite complex. A lot of times I see programs that have really fragmented advocacy and take a very simple, separated approach and are detached from the people they work with. And it's quite sad for me to see that. We have this opportunity to really assist that survivor to look at their options in a way that helps them make choices that can be quite transformative. And what I mean by that is that it will make changes that will reach down to the very center of their being. And when we look at the harm of violence and what that does, their spirit has been harmed, and we want to work in ways that nurtures their spirit and gives them the opportunity to embrace themselves. So when we think about making it happen, we want to internalize policy and practice. And what that means is that a lot of times people will make policies and you'll ask staff, like, what's your policy on this? And they don't know it. And the program might have some really great policies that are sitting on a shelf, and the practice is different, that somewhere along the line the policy is not connecting to the practice. So we want to make sure that they're connected both together. And when we think about internalizing it, that everybody working in that program, whether it's 1 or 2 people or 10 people, that everybody has a consistent understanding of the policy and practice and operate in similar ways. Staff need to know the whys and hows of things. So why do we not have a rule of forbidding people from using alcohol when they're staying in our program? What's the intent behind that? Why do we not make people get protection orders? How is this going to be helpful? The more staff can understand that, the more they can communicate and educate that survivor. We want to create forums for practice and exploration. And when we think about that, creating forums, we want to work with staff in a way to where we check ourselves. So we have a check and balance. When I was an advocate, one of the things that was most important for me was that I had an advocate partner who could give me feedback and could help me to see that the way I was talking to somebody was a little stern, or maybe I forgot to say something that was important, or that I did a really good job in talking about a really difficult subject. And so having somebody to help me to kind of mirror back the way I work is really important. And then trying something out with somebody else before I go and deal with something that's really hard for the first time is helpful. We want to revisit and revise our policies periodically. When I'm working with somebody who's developing their program from the ground up, I tell them, don't try to create a policy for every single thing you think could come up. Because as your program develops and evolves, the way you do things changes. So if you create a whole bunch of policies up front, you actually have put a lot of work in on things that won't actually be implemented. So I encourage people to identify and work on their core policies and then build to some degree as they go on some of the other ones, or create a priority list and build them over time. Revisiting and revising is important because when you first start developing your core policies, you're generally either just before opening the doors of your program or just after. So your knowledge has changed with experience, and you start to see what works really well for your program or what doesn't work well. So revisiting and revising is important for you to be able to keep your program operating as solidly as possible. And then you want to see that the result that you intended is happening. And in there, you really want to, and I mentioned earlier about the voices of survivors, you really want to incorporate them as you're re-looking at things and looking at your results to find out what their experience is with your program, because they have a lot of valuable information to share with you. So when I think about our programs and operating shelter and transitional housing program, the thing for me that's so important is remembering the kind of space we create, not just the physical space, but the emotional and spiritual space that we create for survivors. And when I think about saying that I love to go home, we're working with people who have left their home. They often can't go back to that place because it's not a safe space. And we want to work with them in a way that helps them to create something where they will say, I love to go home. And I've worked with women in transitional housing over time where they've been in a program for a longer time. And that's one of the things that I've found so powerful to hear when someone says, it feels great to come home now. And when we hear that, we know we're doing something right. So I want to stop there and give some opportunity to see if there's any questions from anyone or any comments. So I just want to remind you to lift your hand at the top of your screen if you've got any questions or comments. While there aren't any hands raised right now, we'll give you just another minute or two to think. I do want to just remind you that this is the first in a series of webinars that we're doing over the next few months. We have on Thursday, October 16th at the same time, eligibility and program capacity. And then on November 18th, we are working on advocacy within transitional housing. And on December 16th, we're going to spend the entire webinar working with challenging issues. And on December 18th, on safety planning. We also have one other webinar that we are working on confidentiality. Right now we don't have a date for that, but we will be posting that and sending out an announcement. The other thing I want to point out is on this last slide here, you have Red Wind's website address. And on that website, in roughly about 10 days, we will have the recorded webinar posted up on the website so that if you have some coworkers or other people you think might find this webinar helpful, they can go onto our website and access it and view it at their leisure. So there still are no hands raised, so if there are no questions, this will end our webinar for today.
We'd like to thank Victoria for her presentation today. Thank you and have a great day. This concludes our session.
Thank you, Brenda.